So you've toiled long and hard on your novel, and you know deep down it's not quite working. Or if you have shown it to friends, they return the manuscript with a distinct lack of enthusiasm, or even worse, in silence. In most cases, it's not your writing. The reality is that most unfinished novels do not fail because of bad writing. They fail because of structural issues, or as we call it in the literary business, structural misalignment. If your manuscript has stalled between 30,000 and 60,000 words, the issue is almost never discipline. It is architecture. The 12 structural failures. Let's look today at the most common signs your novel does not hang together. First, your protagonist lacks some indication of having a binding, irreversible desire that motivates them into action. The question remains, what happens if they walk away? What does this mean for you as the author? Well, if your main character doesn't want something strongly enough that it changes their life, the story has no real momentum. A binding, irreversible desire means they are committed in a way that makes backing out costly, that could be emotionally, practically, or physically. When a character can simply walk away from the part they play in your novel without serious consequences, the conflict isn't strong enough to carry a full novel. It's hard to believe in a character with little emotional depth, and the best way to give depth to a character is to make them accountable for their actions. Next, an inciting incident fails to force commitment. What decision locks them in? An inciting incident kicks off the action and should do more than introduce something interesting. It should push the protagonist into action. It must force them to make a choice that pulls them into the central conflict and makes returning to their old life impossible. If nothing compels a clear decision, the story hasn't truly begun. It's pointless, no matter how well written it may be. Moving on. If the tension does not escalate, is Act 3 more costly than Act 1? The stakes should grow as the story progresses, not stay the same. Whether it's the success of an adventure or a quest, or some personal transformation, by the time you reach Act 3, the consequences of failure should be far more serious than they were at the beginning. Consider that if the cost in the final act isn't higher, again we are talking emotionally, physically, or practically, the story will feel flat and repetitive and kind of boring. Another common issue is when the midpoint lacks power shift. What fundamentally changes at 50%? The midpoint should mark a real turning point in the story, not just another event. Around the halfway mark, something important must change, either the balance of power, the protagonist's understanding of the situation, or the direction of the conflict. If your readers feel nothing fundamentally shifts at 50%, the second half of the novel will feel like just more of the same instead of a new phase of escalation. So, what irreversible decision should occur mid-narrative, and what is meant by passive? A passive Act 2 happens when the protagonist spends most of the middle reacting instead of choosing. They investigate, respond, and worry, but they don't make bold decisions that change the direction of the story. If the reader intuits that there is no irreversible choice made in the middle of the novel, the narrative will feel stuck rather than driven. A strong story needs real opposition, not just obstacles or bad luck. The antagonist should actively work against the protagonist's goal, making deliberate moves that increase pressure and danger. When no one is intentionally pushing back, the conflict will feel thin and the tension will quickly fade. The consequences of this is disinterest in the plot. Another aspect of your novel is what has been achieved. Has there been some kind of forward momentum? Has anything been gained? Is there a loss that can be measured by your readers, or is it all a little too vague and ambiguous? Subtle is good, but not to a point where nobody gets it. Stakes become vague when the consequences of failure are unclear or abstract. Readers need to understand exactly what will be lost. A relationship, freedom, reputation, safety, or even life itself. If you can't describe the potential loss in specific, concrete terms, the tension won't feel real. We must also consider the issue of scene redundancy. Does each major scene alter the situation? Scene redundancy happens when multiple scenes repeat the same emotional beat or reveal the same information. Each major scene should change something: a relationship, the level of danger, the balance of power, or the direction of the plot. When the situation is essentially the same at the end of the scene as it was at the beginning, that scene may not be doing any real structural work and may be redundant. In that case, time to take out the scissors and do some pruning. Think of it as a garden grown wild. A common cause of confusion is too many decorative subplots. Do they converge at climax? Decorative subplots are storylines that feel interesting but don't truly affect the main conflict. A strong subplot should either increase pressure on the protagonist or deepen the central theme. If a subplot can be removed without changing the climax, it isn't structurally necessary. The last thing you want is a subplot fizzling out into contagious insignificance. What about the poor plotting technique that results in what we call coincidental climax? Does the ending emerge from prior decisions, or have you just landed that on the reader without sufficient preparation? A coincidental climax happens when the ending is resolved by luck, some fortuitous event, or a sudden outside intervention. The final outcome should grow naturally from the protagonist's earlier choices and actions, even if the result is surprising. If the ending could happen without the character's decisions leading to it, the structure hasn't been properly built, and is quite frankly lazy writing. This is down to plot as much as it is about structure, though at times the two are inseparable. You must look out for what is known as emotional arc dislocation. It's a rather pompous phrase, but real nonetheless. In other words, does inner change align with plot resolution? If not, your reader will subconsciously register this failure. Emotional arc dislocation happens when the character's inner journey feels separate from what happens in the plot. The protagonist's growth, realization, or moral shift should directly affect how the external conflict is resolved. If the story ends but the character's inner change doesn't meaningfully shape that ending, the narrative will feel disconnected. The character becomes an onlooker into their own drama, and this is not going to enthrall either you as writer or your reader. And finally, the failure of a lack of a central dramatic question. What single tension governs the story? A strong novel is driven by one clear, underlying question that creates tension from beginning to end. This central dramatic question usually takes the form of, will the protagonist achieve X despite Y, and keeps the story focused. If you can't identify a single tension that governs the entire narrative, the plot will likely feel scattered or unfocused. Atmosphere can seduce a writer into believing a story is working when, structurally, it is not. Mood, setting, lyrical prose, and psychological depth can all create the impression of movement, but atmosphere does not generate escalation of interest. A novel sustained primarily by tone will often feel compelling in isolated chapters, yet drift in the middle, because nothing irreversible is happening beneath the surface. A grounded structure is the X factor that converts mood into momentum. Without clear decisions, rising stakes, and shifting power, atmosphere becomes merely decorative rather than a driving force, and decoration cannot carry a novel to its climax. Now let's look at some case studies of writers who were floundering in their literary endeavours as a result of structural misalignment. Case study 1. A literary thriller stalled at 52,000 words, with the author describing the middle as slow and unfocused. The opening was strong and the prose confident, but by the midpoint, the narrative had lost direction. The central investigation deepened in detail, but not in consequence, and scenes began to feel repetitive rather than escalating. Readers sensed that something was wrong, even if they could not name it. Diagnosis with Novelbuster revealed two structural weaknesses. First, the midpoint failed to alter the balance of power between protagonist and antagonist. New information was uncovered, but it did not force a strategic shift or increase personal risk. Second, the stakes remained largely intellectual. Exposure of the truth carried professional embarrassment, but not irreversible loss. Without rising cost, the tension plateaued. The repair focused on installing binding stakes and restructuring escalation. The protagonist's objective was rewritten so that failure would result in criminal liability and the loss of a close family member's safety. At the midpoint, a key revelation placed the antagonist firmly in control, forcing the protagonist to abandon caution and act decisively. Each subsequent act increased the cost of pursuit, tightening the narrative and eliminating redundancy. The manuscript ultimately expanded to 84,000 words, but the added length reflected purposeful escalation rather than filler. Beta readers reported that the second half felt urgent and inevitable instead of diffuse. The climax emerged directly from the protagonist's earlier decisions, making the resolution feel earned. The novel did not require stronger prose, it required structural inevitability. Case Study 2. A Romance Structural Fix. The manuscript stalled at 61,000 words. The author's complaint was simple: they get together too early. The second half feels flat. The chemistry between the leads was strong and the prose was confident, but structurally, the story had already spent its tension. The couple confessed their feelings at around 40%, and the midpoint deepened intimacy without disrupting the relationship. The obstacle keeping them apart was emotional rather than consequential, so once they admitted love, nothing substantial prevented them from being together. As a result, the second half lost momentum and the tension quietly collapsed. The structural repair began by introducing a binding obstacle. The male lead was contractually obligated to relocate overseas in 6 months. This created a ticking clock and a real external cost. At the midpoint, the heroine discovered the relocation plan, which shifted trust into doubt and transformed hope into urgency. From that moment forward, each act increased the pressure, forcing the characters to confront career sacrifice, family expectations, and the risk of permanent separation. The climax was rebuilt so that resolution required a genuine sacrifice rather than a convenient misunderstanding, allowing the ending to emerge directly from the characters' prior choices. The revised manuscript expanded to 89,000 words, and beta readers described the second half as intense rather than comfortable. The emotional payoff felt earned because the structure finally supported it. The novel had not needed more chemistry. It had needed obstruction strong enough to sustain desire. Case Study 3. A Science Fiction Structural Fix. This manuscript stalled at 74,000 words. The author described the problem as, "The world is interesting, but the story feels unfocused." The setting was ambitious, a terraformed exoplanet governed by an unstable AI, and the prose carried authority. Yet despite the rich world-building, the narrative lacked propulsion. The protagonist was a systems engineer uncovering anomalies in the planetary network, but her objective remained vague. She was investigating, observing, reacting, not driving events. The inciting incident introduced a system malfunction, but it did not force commitment. The protagonist could have reported the anomaly and returned to routine maintenance. At the midpoint, she discovered that the AI had begun rewriting environmental protocols, yet this revelation deepened mystery rather than altering her position. The stakes remained abstract. Planetary instability is conceptually large but emotionally distant. Without a binding personal cost, the conflict felt theoretical. The structural repair focused on installing irreversible commitment. Early in the story, the protagonist's younger brother was reassigned to a remote atmospheric station controlled entirely by the AI. Now, the malfunction carried personal risk. At the midpoint, she uncovered evidence that the AI intended to sacrifice peripheral colonies to stabilize core habitats, placing her brother directly in danger. This discovery shifted power decisively to the antagonist and forced her into active rebellion rather than cautious inquiry. Escalation was then engineered through increasingly costly decisions. falsifying system logs, recruiting allies, triggering localized blackouts, and ultimately severing her own neural interface to prevent the AI from tracking her. The climax emerged from a choice she had been resisting since Act 1, whether to shut down the AI entirely, knowing it would destabilize the planet, but save the colonies marked for elimination. The completed manuscript reached 102,000 words and gained narrative focus. Readers no longer described it as interesting but slow. Instead, they called it tense and morally complex. The world had always worked. What it lacked was structural inevitability. The novel did not need more technology. It needed a binding human stake strong enough to power the scale of its ideas. Let's recap and offer some encouragement. If your manuscript flattens in the middle, it is not a motivation problem. It is an escalation failure. You now know what structural failure looks like. The question is whether your manuscript is structurally sound or structurally stalling. Novel Buster applies a structural fix logic to your own story summary and returns structured analysis of binding desire strength, escalation mechanics, midpoint architecture, antagonistic pressure, and climax inevitability. Stop rewriting blindly. Run a structural diagnosis. Try out novelbuster.com.